So Golden Years photo exhibit is a collection of vintage press photos that were collected over 20 years by the curator, Victor Barnuevo Velasco, highlighting and showcasing the period of martial law in Philippines, including the rise and fall of the Philippine dictator Ferdinand Marcos Sr. I didn't always grow up in the Philippines, but there was one year that we went back from 85 to 86 towards the end of the Marcos regime, and I was also there to watch EDSA, or People's Power, spring into action to take down a dictator. I think what's important to remember about this photo exhibit is that because it's a traveling photo exhibit, it will only be here in San Antonio this time. I haven't heard of cities that have had this photo exhibit twice. So it's a rare opportunity to catch the photo exhibit, but also on November 1 is a rare opportunity to be able to interact and speak with survivors of that dark period of history of martial law, of severe human rights abuses, where you can ask questions which you won't always have a chance to when you're just watching a documentary of this time period. And I believe when we do hear the stories from the survivors who fought against martial law, we might see some parallels happening today because it involved instances of civilians being surveilled by the regime. It involved violation of workers' rights to unionize. Labor organizers were imprisoned. It also involves the dismissal of indigenous land rights, and with that, the harm to the environment in Philippines. Some of the lands involve, for example, indigenous healing plants and trees that were affected because of the invitation of the Marcos regime to use that land for corporate interests or other interests. There was also ethnic cleansing that targeted Muslim communities, and just the overall violation of free speech that involved extrajudicial killings and disappearing of journalists who were simply telling the truth or reporting on what they saw. So anything that was truthful about the Marcos regime, anything that was in disagreement with the Ferdinand Marcos Sr., they disappeared and were murdered. Their bodies never found again. I believe what we'll hear, the value of listening and hearing the stories and being able to interact with the martial law survivors on the November 1 panel, starting at 5, after a guided tour with a curator at 4:30, will be how their experiences not only talk about that time in history, but how their lives were under surveillance, and some of them were political prisoners, how they survived through that. When we may know some people or some of our relatives or friends of friends who are undergoing the same thing. It's a time to process what's happening today around us, if not to ourselves, with what's happening with people that we know, or just people in the community who share community with us, are undergoing the same thing. So I believe the photo exhibit is valuable because not only is this a collection of photos, but it is a container of the memories and the lives that were taken away from us, taken away from their families during that period of martial law.
This kind of generational trauma of what our country has been through and how we can finally find our voices again after all of the unrest and dis-ease in our bodies. We can move through this together and find somatic ways to release that trauma and to acknowledge this moment in history and try to learn from it and move forward. My desire is to use my art forms of movement and writing, reflective writing, to bring healing back into our bodies and our communities. So to reclaim this narrative of our pain bodies and find a way to have a ripple effect of healing in the broader community.
Being on November 1, some of us celebrated as Day of the Dead.
I was going to ask about that.
And also Filipinos, who grew up in the Catholic Church, celebrated as All Souls Day. But I believe some of us also just honor the day as a time to take a pause to remember our loved ones and those who passed away. I wanted this to be on November 1 and as a way to honor the lives of the victims who died, whether during martial law or who died talking about that period of history and continuing the work even after they left the Philippines and came here in terms of fighting for human rights. Some of the topics that we'll cover will include some things that are, very traumatic topics that women especially endured. Some of them are used as sex slaves, for example. And so at least one of our panelists will talk about experiences like that she observed and witnessed. And because these stories are heavy and are traumatic, we plan to have a moment of somatic movement with music from Kolintangset, which is a set of gongs used in traditional and older Filipino music. The Kolintangset for me symbolizes a time in Philippine history where some villages, because our indigenous practices and our indigenous culture was centered around Babaylan, the Babaylan, who were led by women as well as cross-dressing men. And so these Babaylan, who were mostly women or cross-dressing men in Philippines in our indigenous culture, were the central of leadership, where we did not divide spirituality from physical health, from civic issues and justice. We lived a life where all of that was part of who we were, part of our idea of society. So the leadership that led our villages and our provinces took into consideration the intersection of our emotions and our physical health and conflicts between people and as well as our spirituality. And so I believe that holding this on November 1 is a tribute to that, as well as the somatic movement and accompanying kulintang sounds and other music following the traumatic stories.
Our bodies keep the score, and we remember all of these traumatic experiences, whether that was through the lived experiences or holding the trauma of our parents. And so moving through this pain and releasing it from our bodies is part of the healing process. And also sometimes when we do this kind of work, it's really healing to do it in supportive groups where we can mirror each other and realize that we have empathy for each other and hold space for the healing process in a supportive community.